Hello, this is Josh Spicer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this video. Hello, this is Josh Spicer from GameWisdom.com. Welcome to today's Critical Thought. Before we begin, we're at 685 subscribers up there on YouTube. Thanks so much for subscribing. I hope you enjoy the content. When we hit 700, I got a special treat planned. Originally, today's Critical Thought was going to be about early access and some of the do's and don'ts there, but I realized as I was thinking up the script slash improving it, there's more to talk about that I can easily turn into a post. So that's going to be saved for another day. But I have another one that I've been thinking about lately, and that is micro versus macro design in strategy games. The strategy genre is very much like the RPG, that it's not just about one particular school or philosophy, but can mean to describe different game designs and styles. We have everything from JRPGs like Persona and Shin Megami to more choice altering or character driven ones like The Witcher, and even crazy first person shooter combinations like Skyrim, Borderlands, and so on. But with the strategy genre, there are two dominating schools of thought. That's macro oriented and micro oriented. We'll start with macro, as that's where the genre really took root. Macro-oriented games are more about managing an army or a war, as opposed to individual battles and units. The example up there is from Rise of Legends, which is the sequel to Rise of Nations, which is one of my all-time favorite strategy games. And the allure of macro strategy is that you're not dealing with little skirmishes and 10 guys versus 10 guys. You're dealing with hundreds of units. The big example of that still has its popularity would be the Total War series. And Total War, again, it's not about watching 50 on 50 fights. You are literally managing hundreds of units in a single battle. When it comes to macro-oriented play, as I said, it's more about the war as opposed to the fight. I should be able to manage my resources over here, my bases, my battles, and all of this on multiple fronts of warfare. I shouldn't be focusing on one battle. I should be focusing on multiple fronts, building multiple units, and again, it's more about the planning and being prepared rather than high-speed fingers and micro play. Now, with macro strategy, there are several key elements you have to pay attention to when designing them. The first one is the UI, and strategy games live or die based on UI design, and I could easily talk another critical thought about that, and spend another one just talking about Rise of Nations and how amazing its UI was. But when it comes to macro-oriented strategy games, a good UI needs to be able to give me all the information I need to make smart decisions. I should be able to see the major overlay of what's going on, where my army is, where do I think the enemy is. I need to know all my resources. I should be able to see and manage my base, manage my armies, etc. If I can't get that information, then I'm not going to be able to properly play. Planetary Annihilation is a good example of what not to do. The game was built as the next big esports favored macro game. But the problem is they forgot that new players have to learn how to play. And the UI was just horrible in that regard. Or should I say horrible at the launch. I know they had work on the game for at least a year afterwards. But there is no mini-map. It was very hard and confusing to play because you're dealing with 360 degrees of view on the planets, and getting information about what's going on was just very hard. Now, with the macro layer, again, I shouldn't be focusing on individual units or, special unit powers. It's more about managing these regiments or groups. It's less about, again, these quick actions, but I should be able to make grand plans. Like, let's say if I see a mass army coming down from the north, I should be able to command my cavalry to maybe go to the side, sneak around, and then flank them. Or, there we go, in the right direction there. And again, while I'm doing that, I should be able to manage my base, manage what my resources are doing, and make these plans and commands all over. Now, with that said, there are pros and cons to macro-oriented play. Again, with macro, it's less about high-speed actions. So, for people who aren't good at micro play or hotkey usage, you can still get by with macro for the most part. Second, because it is about fronts and warfare, strategic planning is definitely going to be a key point. So if you're a thinker rather than a rapid player, you're going to do well. The problem with macro and why it's fallen out of favor in terms of mainstream, it comes down to two things. The first is that it's incredibly boring to watch. Because you are focusing on massive conflicts and zooming way out to see everything, it doesn't make for an entertaining match for people watching. They don't want to watch, 20, blips on map moving like this, and then watching them disappear one at a time. Another thing is, macro-oriented focuses a lot more on the UI, and especially on trying to come up with a lot more balancing and just figuring out how you want the game to play. Again, Rise of Nations is completely different from Age of Empires, which is completely different from Total War. And it does limit their appeal, because it is focusing more on the abstraction rather than the player skill. With that said, over the last decade, and maybe even beyond that with StarCraft, there has been a greater play for micro-oriented games. Micro is about focusing on a conflict. We're not dealing with hundreds of units. At most, we may deal with 100 to 200, counting your workers back at your base who won't be fighting. In these games, it's about making high-speed plans, quickly adapting, and being able to effectively manage individual units. So now, it's about saying, okay, here are my 5 guys. I'm going to take these 2, move them up here, get them in a sniping position. This guy's going to sneak around, get around this building, throw a grenade at this tank. These 2 will stay here behind cover and properly manage or properly try to keep the enemy contained. And you're making these plans within fractions of a second. Some really good examples of micro-oriented play, which I'm sure you guys know about, would be StarCraft. StarCraft is really about making these plans and then quickly being able to carry them out. And when you watch competitive or tournament level play, you can see how fast these players are responding. They are setting up stasis fields and quickly getting to flanking positions within seconds. They easily have over 150 actions per minute. And I could never play those games. I just don't move fast enough with these fingers. But it's all about, the plan is simply the foundation. Once the battle starts, it's going to be about how quickly you can execute that plan. You are still making plans, but it's about focusing on an individual battle or an individual conflict rather than front A, B, and C down here. Another good example, one that really rose in popularity, is even more micro-oriented play with games like Company of Heroes and the Dawn of War series. Now you really are commanding individual squads, and it's about how effective you can control them. And what they did to make them extra challenging is have very powerful units or very conditional units. For instance, a tank, if you don't get your units properly behind it to flank it with a rocket or grenades, it's just going to wipe out all your infantry. And it basically creates these sort of like 2 tiers of combat between the individual soldiers and then the vehicles. Now, with micro-oriented play, it is focusing more on the player rather than the game. Fast fingers and being able to quickly adapt is going to win over strategic planning and being able to properly manage multiple fronts. It's also a lot more popular in the esports community due to its high speed of play, the visual feel of watching all these units just run in and bash each other and things exploding and stuff like that. And it also makes it easier to follow. Again, when you only are managing several dozen units as opposed to several hundred, you can effectively watch that a lot easier than something like Total War or Rise of Nations. And a big part of the esports community has really risen thanks to this kind of play. And as an interesting aside, micro-oriented play is pretty much the basis for all MOBA style games. So League of Legends, Dota, Heroes of the Storm, and so on were all given birth thanks to micro-oriented focus and being a mod, I believe, for Warcraft 3. And again, because you're focusing on individual units, you're able to give them a little bit more of a personality or a feel to them. The Terran Marine has a lot more utility to him compared to, a dozen spearmen in Age of Empires. And it's all about creating these very interesting units and then figuring out how to properly balance them. With that said, there are a few disadvantages. While a strong UI isn't as required because of the fact that it's more focusing on the player, you are going to spend more time with unit balancing and coming up with effective unit abilities and stuff like that. StarCraft and StarCraft 2 are amazing examples of this. Blizzard spends an ungodly amount of time and energy focusing on every unit's ability, their stats, down to the decimal point. They want to make sure that everything is balanced within their spec. There's no one dominating strategy, no one dominating unit, and the amount of work they've done is definitely worthy of being studied. For instance, what they've done with the basic units, for instance, the Terra Marine, Protoss Zealot, and Zerg Zergling, is the Terran Marine is worth 100 minerals, and you get 1 unit. The Zergling is worth 100 minerals, but you get 2 of them. 2 Zerglings can beat 1 Marine, only if they can get close and surround them. But 1 Marine can beat 1 Zergling. And then I know there's more with the Protoss who are worth more. And this kind of balancing between unit stats and pricing and effective matchups, and even when you start throwing in special abilities like the Zealot's ability to charge or stim packs, just throws more and more factors into the equation. And again, it is just fascinating to look at that design. But it is a nightmare, I bet, to properly balance. Because again, every little change you make is going to affect the greater picture. Changing a spearman's health points by 5 is not going to mean that big of a deal when we're dealing with hundreds of units all clashing at the same time. But giving the Terra Marine even just 10 more points of health can mean big things for everything involved. The other problem with micro-oriented is that it's hard to say this because it's not really a niche, but it does limit your appeal. Because macro-oriented is more about the planning and effectively management of your units, it does make it a little bit more inviting for players. Micro is more about high skill, and I know I just cannot play those games anymore. I can never be a StarCraft 2 pro player. And because of that, that limits those kinds of games. And we could, technically speaking, it's limiting a niche genre. Because as we've seen, strategy has definitely gone down. It's not as popular as it was 10 years ago. Especially with the heights of Age of Empires, Rise of Nations, and even games older than that, like Command & Conquer. And there's also other strategy games like, I think Kohan, I think that's the name of it, that was also really big. But the market has definitely moved on to micro. To wrap up today's critical thought, I would love to see more developers try their hand at macro strategy games. I know the War Games series is really popular, but it's also very challenging to get into. And that's definitely indicative of both macro and micro. These are not easy games to learn, and for new players, it's very easy to be overwhelmed. When I first tried Supreme Commander, it just, was too much for me to handle back in the day. But I was able to learn Supreme Commander 2. Another good example of a macro-oriented game that I'm actually not sure how well it was received was Sins of the Solar Empire, which was again a take at the macro plus grand strategy genre. I know the developers have released another strategy game which I have not had a chance to play yet. And I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but I don't. But for final thoughts for today's critical thought, macro and micro cannot be combined. These are two completely different schools. You can't ask a player to focus on 5 different fronts all around the map and then challenge them to command individual units right here in high speed. It's just too much to handle. And that's why when you're building your strategy game, you need to understand what you're building and who you're aiming it for. Micro-oriented play, you want, very custom or very personalized units with wide varieties of tactics and abilities. With macro-oriented, I want effective means of planning, management, and I want to see these big battles. And again, I want to make grand plays, not individual actions of moving 2 or 3 units around. And again, we can easily dedicate a few critical thoughts talking more about UI design. And hell, we could spend even a few more of that talking about grand strategy and 4X play. Again, the strategy genre has really become a blanket term for a number of philosophies, and we are approaching 17 minutes and we really haven't even begun to scratch the surface. But that's going to do it for this critical thought. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them below. Check out our Patreon campaign in order to help support everything. And once again, I'm Josh Spicer from GameWisdom.com. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't, and we'll hopefully see you at 700. And I'll talk to you again tomorrow with another critical thought. Anyway, have a great night. See you all then. Thanks for watching the video, everybody. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment, of course, share with your friends. It always helps out. Check out game-wisdom.com, where I examine the art and science of games. You can follow me on Twitch and Twitter under GW Bicer for the latest updates of new content. And be sure to check out our Patreon campaign. You can find us on Patreon under Game Wisdom if you would like to donate and help contribute to keeping Game Wisdom going. Your donations can not only give us the monthly funding we need to keep supporting ourselves, but if we can hit some goals, it will mean more great content for you, and there are some nifty little rewards there as well. Thanks again for watching this video, and be sure to tune into the next one real soon.